it's interesting that although people always say we're a new country, in fact, we're quite an old city. And in planning terms, we're a city that predated the development in British planning in the, say, the 1830s. That meant that a city like Melbourne or a city like Adelaide was built around a street grid, and all the streets were nicely laid out in the same distance from each other and so on. Sydney didn't have any of that. So Sydney's streets are basically a mess. They just followed the lie of the land. And there would have been some underlying indigenous tracks too. I mean, that there would have been ways that the local people got from Sydney Harbour down to Botany Bay or across to the Parramatta area or whatever. So those sorts of pre-European influences can also be traced in some of the streets.
So Sydney really became formalised in about 1810 when Macquarie came along and decided to actually do some plannings. And so it really changed and gave Sydney its structure that we still have a lot of today. I mean, he named some after himself. We've got Macquarie Street, but there is also all the British names. So we've got King George, York, Cumberland, Sussex. He also named one after the Queen as well. So we had Charlotte, but Charlotte's gone. And I think that's really interesting. The women lose out always.
Yeah,
they get obliterated, but the men stay around. The whole role of the subdivision of suburbs is really important too, with the real estate and the way that a person's name might get associated to a certain estate. And then they could choose the name. So there are streets with names after their children. So there's lots of Mary streets.
And impossible to find out often the history of those Marys and Adas and Margarets and who they were. But that's actually one way that you get some feminised namings, because through people's children who may or may not have been famous. Yeah. And then as you get out into the suburbs, you tend to get more interesting names, because sometimes suburban names relate to what was actually happening. So a lot of streets have been named after industries and things that happened in those streets in history. So it tells us about the history. The Albion Brewery, so you get Albion Street. Goodlett and Smith's Brickyard, so you get Goodlett Street. People are floating timber at Darling Harbour, so you get Baltic Street, or Lime Street because they're unloading lime. Names that are connected with particular industries and particular events.
It's not always just associated with big industry like that. There's also more pleasant sounding names as well, like with the Baptist nurseries that used to be around the Redfern and Chippendale area.
And Shepherd's. Yeah.
And Shepherd's Nursery. And then when that all got subdivided, they had all names for that. So there's Pine Street and Myrtle Street and Wattle Street, and there's also a few others around Redfern as well. Tilapia.
And in the Shepherd's Nursery, Vine Street, because he experimented with growing grapes in the middle of Chippendale, if you can imagine it.
Sydney used to have a lot of lanes and rights of ways and passages.
Yeah. Passage was in common usage. Court. There's some of the most interesting names, because often they were names that just related to the houses that were in them, so they often changed names. So if the chief guy in the little row of houses was called Teggs, then it's Teggs Row, and then it changes to somebody else's row when the ownership of the houses. So it's mind-bogglingly difficult to work out where you are when you're looking at old historical maps. And then rows and courts and those little tiny streets, a lot of which have disappeared, sometimes had kind of joke names too, like Frying Pan Alley, which was supposed to indicate that it was full of rough-as-guts people who hit each other over the head, I suppose. Or Paradise Row was a famous one, because it was one of the worst bits of housing in Sydney, and all the formal reports said this should be pulled down, nobody should live in it, so they call it Paradise Row.
Those descriptive names are names that you only find one of in Sydney, but there are other names there are heaps of. Like, I guess there's lots of George Streets and Crown Street.
And when a couple of streets joined up, they'd put the street in between and call it Union Street, because it was joining Street A to Street B. In 1875, the council actually eradicated a whole lot of duplications, because there were so many Queens and Victorias and unions and various other things that the postman by then was saying, we don't know where we're going. So every now and again, the council cleans up the names of streets, more so in the inner city than in the suburbs, because there's been more changes in the inner city. There are other reasons why names get changed, though, like for political reasons.
World War One, that's one where sort of having a German-sounding street name was not a good idea.
Schinkler's Lane, I think it is, in Ultimo, gets changed to Bullecourt, which is a famous World War One battle.
There's also in Redfern, Hanover Street, which gets changed to Walker Street.
Sydney streets were so narrow because of the age of the city. By the early 20th century, there were huge resumptions of property to widen streets, so Park Street and Oxford Street and Elizabeth Street and whatever were widened, but also areas were flattened and resumed because they were deemed to be slums, and that got rid of a whole lot of streets, and you get new organisations of streets, so again that becomes difficult in research terms.
And so some of the streets literally disappear in the resumptions, but others, they keep the street names, but the alignment might be totally different, and the numbering totally different as well.
Or later on, somebody comes along and says, we've got a new street here. Hey, there used to be a street called so-and-so, so they use the same name again, but it's in a different place. So what surprises you about the picture of Sydney's past that you build up when you learn about these names is how rural some of the very, very inner areas were, how late in the day, how topography that we ignore today as we drive around in our cars can actually be translated into, oh yeah, there were brick pits here, there was shipping here, these things were going on. It gives you a much more layered view of your city.
Street names, I suppose that's that thing, we take it for granted now, that they've always been there, they've always been those street names. But the history behind them can tell us so much about the social history and the people living there.
And so the more you know, the richer your journeys as you go about the city.